So now we continue with our panel discussion, a little Q&A, and we have some questions, and at the end we will ask you if you have some questions either for Nicole or for Grégory or even perhaps for me. But first let's start with you.
Okay.
Were you, before you came here, and I think you were last week were you in Houston, or did you hear about the Apollo 11 Speedmaster anniversary event in the US? That was.
Yes, and I was at the Kennedy Space Center for the event we had there. Yeah.
Were you aware that there's a Speedmaster community or Speedy Tuesday community that is all about collecting Speedmasters, just one single watch, and that these people love these watch and love space in general?
I will admit I was not aware until that event that there was a Speedy Tuesday, and I understand we have you to thank you for that.
Well, not only me, I think mainly the guests that are all together making the Speedmaster and the Speedy Tuesday community very much alive. So, and if I take one step back from watches and talk about your job at NASA, you worked as an engineer. You have engineering background, and you did assessment of the efficiency of tools that you used during the space shuttle mission. How does the NASA testing procedures look like? How does it work? Does everything has to be 100% perfect before it goes up into space?
Yeah, I would go as far as saying 110%, perhaps. They are looking for any possibility of how something could fail. And whether that's the impact of radiation or the user being too, rough on something, or it shaking too hard when it flies to space on the rocket. And the kinds of tests that, I mean everything from what we wear to the equipment and instrumentation we use to the watches that we fly is put through that very rigorous process. And
even though it's really being tested in a proper way, does anything fail sometimes? Does something break down? And are you panicking, or? Yeah, no. I think
I think we get the panic trained out of us somehow, which is a pretty cool thing. But I think that's why having humans in space is such a great thing to do. Is that humans working with their team on the ground or their crew in space, there's alternatives solution-wise that come up that might not through some kind of computerized algorithm, robotic way to do things. And so being in that loop is really important. And when you think about something failing in space, we are always looking at how do you access something? How do you work around that failure if you have to? And that gets you thinking creatively about the mission in other ways too.
Yeah. We get back to failure of a certain mission later on.
Okay.
I guess you know what it is. But when it comes to testing, in the 60s, NASA did also testing on a certain watch that we all know and love so much. Grégory, can you remind us a bit about testing of the Speedmaster and what made this watch so good for NASA to use?
Good. So maybe before we can start, back in the 50s, when the first Speedmaster was launched, nicknamed the Broad Arrow due to the design of the hands. So the first Speedmaster was, as I said, was born in 1957, driven by the now famous iconic 321 caliber, and at that time it was the first timepiece having the tachymeter on the bezel in order to improve the readability of the time and also the chronograph function. And it's interesting to mention that this watch was not developed as an astronaut watch, but was developed as a racing car driver, also for the racing team, the engineers, even the doctors. And this specific year, the 1957, Omega was actually the first brand developing and selling 3 tool watches, and it was really the first brand in the watchmaking industry offering these 3 tool watches. You can see the Seamaster 300 developed as a diver's watch, water resistance up to 300 meters. All the three watches, they share the same DNA in terms of design. They have the same case body. In the middle, we had the Railmaster, which was magnetic resistant up to 1,000 gauss with the Faraday's case, which is not anymore the case now with the 15,000 gauss technology. And finally, the Speedmaster. Then we have to go to 1962 with the CK2998. In terms of design, we changed the bezel and the hands. So the stainless steel bezel was replaced by the aluminum bezel in order to improve the readability of the tachymeter. And it was actually the first Omega in space, not really official, but it was the watch was run actually by Wally Schirra and also Gordon Cooper, thanks to the original Sevens, the first crew being in space from the American side. Then, if we talk about the third generation of the Speedmaster, the ST-105-003, and it was that watch which was tested by the NASA. In terms of design, the hands were changed a little bit, as well the pushers. Then let's talk about the fourth generation, the first moonwatch, the ST-105-012, won by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and this generation marks definitely a turning point in terms of design, thanks to the design of the case. So if you have a look on the case band at 3 o'clock, it protects the pushers and the crown. And the wording professional just below Speedmaster was not printing on the dial after the certification, but before. It was in 1964. And then in 1964, exactly the 21st of September, Dick Slayton, the big boss of the astronaut, wanted to supply some chronograph for the crew. So they asked a request for quotation. They asked 10 brands and only 4 response. Only 4 brands response. There was Hamilton, but they didn't really check the specification. They sent a kind of marine chronometer watch, even bigger than the pocket watch, and they wanted really to have a wrist chronograph. Then Longines, Rolex, and Omega, their response. So we actually Jim Ragan, which was the big boss behind the NASA test. He checked all the three watches, and with exactly 11 tests, such as low, high temperatures, shock test, noise, acoustic noise test, vacuum chamber, high humidity. So in total, 11 tests. And the only watch which survived was the Omega. It was the ST-105-003, also driven by the iconic caliber. And then the first official mission was the Gemini 3, was actually the first manned mission of the Gemini program. And of course, we all know that the Gemini 4, a few months after Gemini 3, with Ed White as the first American spacewalk. So it was the first EVA for the Speedmaster. And yeah, that's a really nice picture. That's why we still name this ST-105-003 the Ed White by the collectors.
Very good. Thank you. This is, I can imagine this is only the watch that astronauts use. There's so much more equipment. And I think for every piece of equipment, the tests are really rigorous. Mm-hmm. So this is only one of the many things you bring with you in space. But why actually do you need a watch in space? Because I guess you have computers to show you tasks, to show timing. What makes it that you really need a wristwatch?
Well, I think it's, you have the computers with the schedule, kind of the timeline for your day there. But there's something about, I think it's the same as down here on Earth as it is in space. There's this relationship with time that we have that you want there with you too. So just that basic nature of it, having the watch with you as your immediate reference for what time it is. And in space, time can be difficult, in that orbit around the Earth, with orbiting the Earth 16 times a day, and those sunrises and sunsets happening, you can't use day and night as your cycle or your reference for time. So, your stomach's telling you when you're hungry for lunch and when you're tired for going to bed at night, but that relationship to time throughout the day, it needs to be with you. And for me, there were key things, like I'm telling you the truth when I talk about setting an alarm to remind me to go back to work. And Omega has the best alarm on it. It's loud and solid, and when you needed to wake up in the morning, it was loud and solid. And for timing, we have loads of tasks that we time throughout the day too, that you can't just look at the computer for or rely on the ground calling you. You've got to have it right there with you. And I think it's kind of this personal relationship with it.
Yeah.
Exactly 72 dB.
Yeah, it works, man. I'll tell you.
So, Gregory, for you, why is it important that astronauts need to have precise time? And perhaps this is also a good moment to mention the failure of equipment in space with Apollo 13. There, the Speedmaster had a very specific role.
Yeah, sure. I think all of you know about the great story about the Apollo 13. Houston, we had a problem, and before returning safely on Earth, the crew need to do a correction, and they receive the time for burning the engine. And I don't think if you noticed that, we all know that it was 14 seconds, but the first time was 15 seconds. So Houston said 15 seconds, and then they correct. So please -1 second because of the heat of the burning engine. So the crew had to calculate to do the timekeeping with exactly 14 seconds. Actually, they did 13.8 seconds after the space report, and of course they use the chronograph. And if your chronograph, your watch is not accurate, no way to calculate exactly 14 seconds. So thanks to this correction, the crew could entering safely on Earth. And that's a great story. And a few months after the Apollo 13 mission, Omega received, I think from the hand of General Tom Stafford, Omega received the Silver Snoopy Award. And that's why we like to play with the Silver Snoopy or the Snoopy when we are developing a special series, a special Speedmaster, which is linked with the anniversary of the Apollo 13 mission.
Okay. Back to space again.
Okay.
You showed us a beautiful picture of you outside the spacecraft, and I asked you before, was it scary? But especially your mom found it scary.
Yes.
Can you describe or share with us that exact feeling that you had when you exited the spacecraft? How did that feel?
Yeah, I think like launch, there are certain things that nothing really prepares you for it, and there's the simulator versus reality. One of the things that's really reassuring is that our simulators are really good. So a lot of the reality is very close to what you experience in the simulator, but there are aspects of it that cannot be recreated that way. When I came out of the airlock, I came out feet first. So I come out feet first, I had to, kind of swing around, and as I'm swinging around to get the the handrail that circles around the airlock, and then kind of be upright, I guess. And that first view of the Earth below you through this tiny little visor that you have, and that's all that's between you and space. There's nothing in any of the simulators that recreates that in a way that feels real. The Earth really feels like it's 250 miles away when you come out of the hatch like that. There's this wide open space around you, like that black that was shown in the picture. And when we train, we're in a pool. So there's a pool bottom, and there's pool walls, and there's divers all around you. There's not this sense of openness that I've never felt like that, before or after that spacewalk. It's like you are one with the universe in that space. And you go out with a very respectful, deliberate diligence. Kind of the precision of the watch is almost the way you're having to operate when you're moving around the outside of the station, to respect where you are and put that tether on, make your mom happy, have at least one hand on the station.
Sometimes we see, we saw some pictures of astronauts doing a spacewalk with a watch on their sleeve. I heard you didn't. You're not wearing the watch outside in space, but you wore the watch inside the spacecraft. And it was a Speedmaster X33.
Yep.
Because of the alarm, I think people already guessed so, and saw it on the picture. You were wearing one. I also saw another astronaut wearing like multiple watches, and that's to measure like the body temperature, perhaps, or the heartbeat, or all sorts of.
Yeah, they have these other instruments that we wear. One of them is called an ActiWatch, and it's not. It has time in it, but it's not giving you, the time of day in any way, and it's measuring your motion, and it's really used to gauge how much you're sleeping at night, how restful your sleep is, and your motion throughout the day. Some people will wear multiple watches, and I had one crewmate who had their Omega and then like a Casio or something, and then there was one who had like 2 Omegas. He started his collection in space, and I imagine he might even have more now. But it's, there are so many things you can use it for. The alarm for sure, just the reference throughout the day. But you mentioned this timing, this Apollo 13, kind of critical timing. We used our watches as backup to the time on the control panel, to the time on the computer. We always backed it up. And it was really interesting to see how these things synchronized in a way that just, you knew you could trust it as your prime source too.
Yeah. Was there time to use your X33 to time things that you wanted to time off the record?
Well, I did that. There, it has the mission elapsed time function on it. So I did use that when we got clearance that we had launched. So as soon as I knew we launched, that started, and then that kept going until we had wheel stop on the ground, and then stopped it and held it that way. And that watch is my son's watch. I've had it in safekeeping. It hasn't really seen the light of day other than to get out and get checked and wound and make sure it's still functioning. I think it's the most precious thing I think that I had in space with me that I knew would be able to carry forward for my family with my son longer. Yeah,
beautiful. So Gregory, the X33 watch, it was introduced in '98.
Correct.
What inspired the creation of this watch? How did it develop? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. But before talking about the X33, let's finish maybe the timeline. So from 1957 to 1965, Omega introduced these different references, all driven by the caliber 3-to-1 caliber. And in 1968, this year marked a turning point, so we changed the caliber. So the 3-to-1 was replaced by the 861. With 2 major changes. We raised the frequency from 2.5 to 3 Hertz, and we replaced also the column wheel by a shuttle cam system. in order to be more industrial, to have less setting by the watchmaker. This is the last generation, the Moonwatch of today, which is still approved and certified by NASA, especially for the EVA, the extravehicular activities, and is still the watch of Moonwatch of today. The big change is definitely the movement with radium-plated treatment for all the blends. And 1 year after came out the first generation of the X33, which was linked with the Mars project. So this watch was named the Mars watch, and it took exactly 5 years of development between Omega and the different space agency. And the idea was to have analog display. And I think it's better to have an analog display than a digital display, especially when your body is shaking like hell. I think it's better to have a digital display and analog display, and then the digital display with the different functions such as the mission elapsed time, which is quite useful for the astronaut. And then in 2001 came the second generation of the X33 with minor changes such as the satin brush bezel and pushers. And the watch was actually launched inside the Mir station with a direct broadcast. And I have also to mention that the latest version of the X33 came out in 2014, and it was a great collaboration with the European Space Agency, and especially with the astronaut Jean-François Clairvoy, which gave us a lot of inputs, especially regarding the function of the watch. So this watch, which has a different display, features functions such as the phase elapsed time, which is also quite useful for the astronaut.
Okay, thank you. So did you, Nicole, in space, you used the X33. Was there any functionality that in retrospect you would like to have had on the watch that wasn't there? Perhaps for future development?
Maybe some diamonds?
Wow, yes, diamonds would be good. This one's very nice. Yeah, I don't know. I love the way it functioned. I think it's kind of like when I look at this watch, we talked about this a little bit, this kind of the simplicity in the presentation, both from a beauty standpoint, I think just aesthetically, and then the simplicity and the way the functions worked was, I mean, that's key to me, to continue to keep whatever function you incorporate simple. Yeah.
So one of these functions is a very loud alarm.
A very loud alarm.
Very loud. Last year we had a Speedy Tuesday event in Moscow, and there were no astronauts. There was a cosmonaut, Alexander Samokuchayev.
Yes.
If I'm pronouncing it correctly. And he told me an anecdote that he had the X33 on his wrist, and he absolutely loves it. Still today, he's wearing it as his everyday watch. And he told me that at some point in space, in the spacecraft, he lost his watch, and he couldn't find it. And he was searching and searching, and at some point they were all searching. So can you imagine all these astronauts, cosmonauts searching for one watch on board, floating around? But on day 3, the alarm went off, and that way they could locate the watch because it's so loud that they could find it back and put it on the wrist, and he didn't lose it afterwards anymore.
There were people that wished their glasses had that alarm.
I can imagine, yeah.
Those got lost a lot.
Yeah, that was my question. Do you have any like unique memories or things that happened to the watch, or something else fascinating that happened on board that you can share with us?
I don't know, the watch I tried to keep very safely on me or attached to this one little Velcro hook I had in my crew compartment. But the glasses story is kind of a funny one, because I could see that happening with Sasha's watch, like you described, so easily. If you let go of anything, you think that it's just going to float in front of you because you float when you're there, but there's airflow in the station. So if you let go of something, it's going to go. It's going to be lost. It might go to the filter, the air conditioner filter somewhere that you might expect it, but it might take 3 days or 3 months to find it, if ever. That kind of, environment is interesting to work in because you're having to strategically think about stuff all the time. You can't just set something down. Every job you do, it depends on you being organized in a way that I never really was down on Earth. And it's why something like an alarm, which seems like why is that the function that you love the most about the watch? It is so important when every 5 minutes of your day is being planned for you and you're having to find some way to keep track of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Gregory, do you have any memories or did you hear stories from astronauts? Because you speak to some astronauts, I guess, in the line of duty. Did you hear about stories about the Speedmaster specifically that you can share?
Not the X-33, but maybe some anecdotes regarding the Moonwatch. I think one of the great anecdotes is that General Tom Stafford wore 2 watches because the Moonwatch has no second time zone. So there were 2 watches, one for Houston time and the other one for the mission elapsed time. So this function are actually in the X-33. There's another one with Ed White. Ed White and I get this anecdote from Jim Ragan, and actually 2 watches, one for Houston time and the other one for timing the EVA. Of course, I think everybody know the great anecdote or story about the connected watch of Gene Cernan. When he was on the moon for the Apollo 17 mission, almost 3 days on the moon. He had, of course, the Houston time, and he knew that at 7 o'clock my daughter will wake up and then take a breakfast. And it was very important for him having a connection between the moon and the Earth.
Thank you. So one last question, but it needs a bit of an introduction and perhaps also a story to share with you. I noticed some of you, they have the Speedmaster Speedy Tuesday 1 watch on today. And perhaps you don't know because we didn't really share this story that often. It is based on the Speedmaster Alaska 3 watch. It was the Speedmaster Professional tested for NASA in '78 for Space Shuttle. And it had a different dial. The subdials are a bit different. It's a radial dial. I also saw someone that has one original radial dial watch with him today. That watch, there were 56 of these watches were sent to NASA in '78, '79 for use on the Space Shuttle. And one day, I received an email from a Dutch astronaut, Wubbo Ockels. He was an astronaut on the Space Shuttle mission in '85, STS 61A. I think he was a load specialist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I think so.
And although he didn't wear a Speedmaster on board because he was from the European Space Agency, they had different type of equipment, different type of tools perhaps. And but he did have some watches, and he asked me someday, I think in 2012, so that's the magical year with Speedy Tuesday, he asked me if I could meet his son to have a look at some of his watches. And I invited the son over to my house, and on a Saturday morning he arrived and he came with this plastic shopping bag from the supermarket. And he held it upside down on my kitchen table, and there were watches falling out. And one of them, there were all sorts of watches, two Speedmasters, one X-33, and one Speedmaster that didn't look very familiar to me, and the dial was different, so it was a radial dial. And when I turned it around, it had all sorts of internal NASA inscriptions, internal numbers. And apparently these watches were given to astronauts also during training exercises, and sometimes they, deliberately or not, the watches were not returned. So astronaut Wubbo Ockels, he ended up with this watch through another astronaut who actually used it. And that watch was for us, for the Fratello team at least, and later on also with Omega, we shared this, was the inspiration for the Speedy Tuesday watch in 2017. So now you have the full story behind the design of this watch. Of course, we added the subdials are a bit different. They are silvery white, because otherwise it would be really an exact copy. And we wanted to add some originality to it. So that's the story about the Speedy Tuesday watch. And so that watch is inspired by a watch that was presented to me by the son of this astronaut, Grégory. He passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago. And just before he passed away, he gave an emotional speech on television. I think you can re-watch it on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. He also did it in English. It's really worthwhile having a look at this interview with him, because it's about planet Earth. And he gave an emotional speech about planet Earth and said that we only have one. We only have one planet, so we need to take really good care of it. And he said it's really going the wrong way with the planet, and we really have to take care. And I wanted to ask you, but you already showed it in your presentation. Do you share these emotions? Is it really that important? Is it really going the wrong way with the planet as it's going now?
Well, I think, the three lessons I shared with you, I think, are right in line with what he was saying, is that we all need to accept this interconnectivity, the fact that everything anybody does anywhere on the planet has an impact on everyone else everywhere else on the planet. Down to the simplest micro kind of thing where, if you look at it subatomically, when we rub our fingers together, Brian Cox, the UK astrophysicist, shares this really great story of how the physics of what surrounds us is impacted at the micro level. You heat up with friction between your fingers, and that's affecting all of the electrons throughout the entire universe. It seems wild that would be. So everything we do on this planet is affecting everything else. And in the simplest way to me to look at it is that we talk about saving our planet. And in reality, what we're really talking about is saving ourselves. And the way we do that is we have to proactively manage the resources that were put here in place for us. A little bit closer, a little bit further from the sun, not so good for us. This planet, like this one, is calibrated in a way to take care of us. And we just have to manage the life support system that it provides. We do it every day on the space station. We are acutely aware of how thin the metal hull is of that space station between us and the deadly vacuum of space. The same is true for the atmosphere around our planet. What I do is I hold hope, though. I am optimistic that we are being presented, maybe finally realizing that the data, the information, the stories that Earth is telling us through, many different ways, that we're finally taking that to heart. And as individuals, we're changing our ways, and we're taking on these personal actions, and we're also working with others to facilitate this, just maintaining our life support system.
Thank you. I would like to go to the questions from you guys.
How is it that Omega finds NASA? How did that happen? I mean, because there are many brands, but how is that Omega was exactly synchronizing the time with NASA, Disney? How was it?
Because of the test. So Omega didn't choose the NASA. The NASA chose Omega because of the test. So and they certified the Speedmaster the first launch of 1965. So the NASA tested 3 different brands, as I said, Longines, Rolex, and Omega. And they tested watches, the program watches, with 11 different tests. And the only watch which survived was the Speedmaster.
And it was a tender, right? So NASA wrote to several brands to participate.
Yeah.
And they wrote to headquarters, or to Omega in the US at the time.
In the US, it was Norman Morris.
Another question from the audience.
space and time. As an astronaut, you're the perfect person to ask, because we know that gravity dilutes the time and also velocity. But velocity has a bigger impact. So astronauts go over slower than people on Earth. How does the life in ISS affect you? I mean, 3 months is a long period, night and day, and how is the daily basis you have for eating and sleeping? That is my question.
Well, we try to work to, kind of a routine, I say routine, a structured schedule. So there's the time that you get up in the morning, unless there's a special activity, that's pretty much the same time every day, like 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And then you go through what we call post-sleep activities. So you're getting ready for your day, you're having breakfast, and then you have a call with the ground to talk about the plan for the day, and then lunch is planned pretty much at the same time every day, dinner, that final call.
The day is 45 minutes, right?
The day is 24 hours.
Okay.
And then, but outside the window is every 45 minutes is a sunrise or sunset. And so if we had these big windows surrounding us and the lights were going off and on every 45 minutes, I think that would be really disruptive. But we don't. You have to purposely go to a window to see that happening. But that doesn't mean you're not having to adjust to it a little bit when you get there. But your body tells you when you're hungry too, and so that's a good thing. But it was Terry actually that said, we don't usually find out how much younger we are when we come back. But my colleague said that he was in a meeting with the researchers, and they for some reason were interested in this idea. I think it was more with the radiation exposure, but they had this time measurement too. And it was something like 7 microseconds younger than anybody he was with in the audience that day. So I'll take it.
Well, Nicole, I have a question for you again. In fact, 2 questions. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you. And the first question is really difficult. So, would you say the Earth is flat from the outside?
I would say no. The Earth is not flat.
Yeah. And now there's a serious question. I bet your perspective on Earth changed when looked from above. How do you see the problems from the Earth, like finding a parking spot or the electricity going off, or small problems that from day-to-day basis seem so real and difficult? How do you see them from above, from way beyond the atmosphere?
Maybe the beauty in it is you don't see those things. You don't see the struggle to find the parking spot, or food burning in your kitchen. I mean, those kinds of things that tend to be irritable to you. There's different ones in space, I suppose. You couldn't float from one end to the other fast enough to get to some view out the window. I don't know. There's other things that can bother you, but I think what happens is, this is maybe in a bigger way to look at it, is you look out the window and you see this planet, and I mean, it's just glowing. I mean, it is crystal clear, and it glows. And I describe it this way because I had to describe to my son, who was 7, what did the Earth look like when I talked to him for the first time. And all I could tell him was, imagine you have the brightest light bulb you could ever think of, and you've splattered it with all the colors that you know Earth to be. Then turn it on, and you almost have to adjust to looking at it because it is just so bright and beautiful. And every time you look out the window, you see this bright and beautiful place. But if you look closely, you can see things like the big hurricane, this storm moving across the ocean. And I remember thinking that, wow, it's like I'm watching all of this with the mute button on. It's silent and peaceful, and you see this thing that looks beautiful from space, when if you were on the other side of it, you know that it's not, and that the people underneath it are not experiencing it the same way that I was looking at it from space. It's not a nice billowy white beautiful thing to the people that are on the planet experiencing it. And I think there's so many of those kinds of things that were going on that as you looked out the window, you had to consider it not just from this really special vantage point you were having from space, but from what you know of how those things are down on Earth as well.
Any more questions from you? No? If not, then thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, and
Thank you.
thank you. And perhaps you don't know, but I think part of the fun with Speedy Tuesday is that we take a wrist shot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Put it in square mode.
All right. Is there a particular way here?
I think this is a good way.
It's my man hand.
Perfect. Thank you. Now we have a small break, and after the break we finally get to look at the Steel Speedmaster Apollo 11 that you haven't seen yet, and some of you already saw the gold ones, but they're also here. Thank you.